Good morning. Today is our last lesson in chapter 23. Get back over here to my notes. We are going to talk about the last few countries of Western Europe in the aftermath of the Cold War and what is going on. We're going to bring them basically into the end of the 20th century. Excuse me, the end of the 20th century. So we've done really well this year to get this far, and I'm really very pleased about that. But today will hopefully be your last lesson for world history. Next week, we will have a Zoom meeting on Tuesday, on Tuesday at 11 a.m. Just checking my schedule there. Tuesday at 11, and I'll post that information for you later. We will discuss the exam at that point. And other than that, you need to be catching up on your assignments and making sure that you have everything done and ready to be graded. I am working this weekend on grading and getting caught up. So make sure that anything that you had that had a 0 on it, that you have resubmitted that and turned it in. Okay? All right, so let's talk about where is the United States going into the post-war. We've talked a bit about it already, but we're looking at basically at 1950, 1960, and forward. The United States went through a period right after World War II of great wealth and prosperity. So much so that one particular journalist called it the affluent society, meaning we all had enough. To go with this, we also continued big government ideas, the idea that the government was going to solve all of our problems. And one way that they did that was President Johnson's Great Society. That was his promotion when he became president in the 1960s. He said he was going to fight a war on poverty. His goal was to end poverty in America. He was going to spend tax dollars on housing, education, Medicaid, Social Security, many different programs in order to fight this war on poverty. But not everything was perfect in the United States, and the civil rights movement was just getting some real footing going in the United States at this point. Men like Martin Luther King Jr. were leading that fight and helping us to get to the point in our society where indeed all men were created and women were created equal. It was something that we really had to fight for. We had the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and we're still fighting this war today for to get to the point where the color of your skin does not matter to the person next to you. We also saw in this time a generational conflict. Generations are, you're one generation, your parents are an older generation, and your grandparents an older one yet. So a generational conflict is a conflict between parents and children. And that's what we had in the 1960s as children revolted against their parents in many different ways. We saw the drug culture become a real problem as sexual immorality became a problem, all kinds of different things. And at the heart of this issue was also the war in Vietnam. Men avoided the draft, became draft dodgers, is what they were called. They fled the country to get away from having to serve military time in Vietnam. Vietnam was a huge issue in the 1960s. It divided Americans on their opinions of whether or not we should be fighting in Vietnam. It also lessened our affluence at that point. So at this point, that's going to be a draw on American funds because Johnson tried to fund the war in Vietnam without raising taxes. And that's going to lead to economic stagnation. Our economy stopped growing. Unemployment started rising, as did inflation, and that causes an economy to stagnate and to get to be too much to grow. Um, we also saw in this time a national drift in leadership. We had a couple of men in succession, beginning with Nixon, who actually resigned as president, and then his successor, Ford and Carter, who were just, they weren't that great of a leader, didn't excite the American people. And they quickly turned on them and voted them out of office in the next term until like we came to the 1980 presidential election and Ronald Reagan was elected. Ronald Reagan is probably one of my all-time favorite presidents. He was the first one to really question the welfare state. Do we really need to be promoting the idea of a welfare state? In other words, one where the government supports the people, or do we need to do something else? So he was the one who wanted to do something else, and he promoted the defeat of communism as well as the end of the welfare state, reduced the taxes, and got our economy moving again. He was succeeded by George H.W. Bush, who oversaw the decline of communism in the early 1990s. He also continued Reagan's policies and fought Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. He was followed by Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton kind of returned everything back to the welfare state policies that we had been having. Okay, let's look at Western Europe. The first country the first country your notes talk about is Germany, but we need to mention Spain very briefly here. Spain had fallen to the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco right before World War II started. I hope you remember that. But Franco died in 1975, and when he died, the kingdom was restored to King Juan Carlos, and Juan Carlos decided to turn it into a democracy. He restored democratic government to Spain, and Spain actually joined the European Union in 1985. Then Germany. Germany, of course, is divided. It's West Germany and East Germany. West Germany is free. East Germany is communist. Adenauer, who is the man pictured here, Konrad Adenauer, rejected socialism. He had actually been taken prisoner during the war by the Nazis and told to just, curl up and die in this jail cell because your life is over. But he did not accept that. And after the liberation of Germany at the end of the war, he became the first chancellor of West Germany. And he led Germany into becoming an economic superpower. It wasn't a military superpower because they were not allowed to have a big military after World War II, but they did become an economic superpower. Their recovery was amazing, and it was a wonderful thing to see. East Germany, not so much, but then they'll be reunited in the mid 1990s or early 1990s. I can't remember which. Okay. Let's talk about France here very briefly. France had their third republic with Napoleon. They fall to communism, not to communism. They fall to the Nazis in World War II, and afterwards they need to reestablish a government. Charles de Gaulle had been the leader of the provisional government, the Free France government that was underground while they were under the control of the Nazis. And after the war ends, he helps bring in the Fourth Republic. The problem is that as they bring in that Fourth Republic, the Constitution that is written and the government that's selected it's not good enough. They didn't make a good enough effort at it. What happened was they didn't give enough power to the president. The power wasn't divided evenly enough, so the whole republic became weak and ineffective. And because of that, de Gaulle resigns and he leaves. He says, I'm going to retire. I'm getting out of here. I'm tired of this. And then France starts losing some battles around the world. They lost their colony at Vietnam. They lost in a battle they fought with the British over the Suez Canal. They fought with the British, and then they ended up turning the canal over to Egypt. They had endured a couple of different humiliating defeats there. So they're losing their empire. The Fourth Republic's not working. So eventually the army of France brings de Gaulle back to start a Fifth Republic. And he becomes the first leader of the Fourth Republic and the Fifth Republic. But the Fifth Republic did a much better job of writing their constitution. And because they did it that way, the Fifth Republic is still the government of France. The only one that's lasted longer than this Fifth Republic was the Third Republic after Napoleon. They have a good constitution now. They are heading towards socialism, but for the most part, they're doing much better. Let's talk about Great Britain, lastly. All right, Great Britain, after World War II, becomes a country in transition and decline. They are turning towards socialism. They are establishing, they're losing their territories very quickly. India, Pakistan, Burma, all of those have been given their freedom. Others are getting their freedom. Those in Africa are getting their freedom. They're losing their empire around the world. And the Labour Party came to power right as World War II was ending, and they start nationalizing industries, meaning the government is running their major industries, like their coal industry and transportation and things like that. And that is not a good sign for Great Britain because it is a nation in decline. Until 1975, when along comes the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. The Iron Lady is her nickname, but she was a member of the Conservative Party, and she saw this tend towards socialism that Britain was going through and decided to turn it around and turn it back towards a republic, towards democracy, and see if she could restore the glory of the Empire of Great Britain. And she indeed did. She sold many of those nationalized industries back into the private sector, got them back in private hands, and she stood with the United States president in a lot of different foreign affairs. She was just an incredible leader for Great Britain. She adopted many anti-communist policies, and she served longer than any other prime minister since the early 19th century. She was a wonderful lady. And that ends chapter 23. I hope you have taken good notes and do well on your quiz. And I will see you next Tuesday for that Zoom meeting. Okay? Y'all have a good weekend.